Okay, so on notes 5.4, we're going to be solving quadratic equations by factoring. Okay, so before we start solving, let's talk about what a quadratic equation is. When you have a quadratic equation, you have an x squared in your equation. That's the highest exponent that you will have there. Okay, so the first step is to set each equation equal to 0. When you have a quadratic equation, the standard form is ax squared plus bx plus c equals 0. So once you have it in that form, you're going to factor it completely. And then once you have factored it, you're going to set each factor equal to 0 to solve for x. Okay, so let's look at this first example here. Notice it's not set equal to 0. Remember when we were factoring, we talked about our a, which was the coefficient of x squared. We always want it to be positive. Notice that our x squared term is already positive, which means I don't want to subtract it to the other side. Okay, so the first step I'm going to do is subtract x and subtract 30 on both sides. So I have a 0 on that right side now. So write it in standard form, so x squared first, then minus x, and then minus 30. Okay, so we have our equation equal to 0. Now we're going to factor it. So if you look at your blue sheet, when you're factoring with 3 terms, first thing you check for GCF, but they don't have a GCF. So with 3 terms, you're wanting to figure out the 2 numbers that will give you the sum, which is your middle number, that's -1. The product, which are your outside numbers, notice that's -30 and that's a 1, so we get -30 for the product. Okay, so we're wanting to add to -1, multiply to -30. So that would be a -6 and a +5. Okay, so we factored it, and notice since this is a 1 in front of x squared, we don't have to use the swing method because we would get the same exact thing. Okay, so once you have factored completely, so factored until you can't factor anymore, you're going to set each one of your factors equal to 0. So I'm going to have x minus 6 equals 0. So when I solve for x, I get x equals 6. And then the other one, x plus 5 equals 0. So when I solve for x, x would equal -5. Okay, so when you're solving a quadratic equation, most of the time, or the majority of the time, you're going to have 2 solutions, so 2 answers. So your solution here would be x equals 6 or a -5. If you wanted to check your solution, you could just plug it back into your original equation and it should be true. Okay, so let's take a look at number 2. So first step, if you look back up at the top, is to set each equation equal to 0. So notice it's not equal to 0. Look at your x squared term because we always want it to be positive. Notice it's already positive, so I don't want to move it. So that means I'm going to subtract 10x. So you have 3x squared minus 10x minus 8 equals 0. Okay, so first step is to find the GCF. Notice those 3 terms do not have anything in common. So 3 terms, if you look at your blue sheet when you're factoring, you're wanting to find the 2 numbers that will give you the sum, which is the middle number. So sum would be -10. Product would be the outsides, which would be -24. Okay, so you're wanting to add to -10, multiply to -24, which means one term needs to be negative. So that would be -12 and +2, because we want a -24. Okay, so when we factor that, that would be x minus 12 and x plus 2 equals 0. All right, so looking in front of the coefficient in front of x squared, it's a 3, which means I need to use the swing method. So I'll divide each one by 3. Reduce before you swing, so that would be x minus 4. And I can't reduce that, so I can swing that 3 in front. That's 3x plus 2 equals 0. Okay, so I'm done factoring. Once I've factored to solve for x, you're setting each one of your factors equal to 0. So x minus 4 equals 0, so x would equal 4. And 3x plus 2 equals 0. So if you can't figure that one out, actually work it out. Subtract 2. Divide by 3. So you get x equals negative 2/3. And leave it in fraction. So the two solutions we would have are x equals 4 and negative 2/3. Again, to check it, you can plug both of those back in for x into your original equation, and it should be true for both of those two x values that you're plugging in. Okay, let's take a look at number 3. Alright, so first step is to set it equal to 0. Notice it's already set equal to 0. So first step when we factor is GCF. So notice they have an x in common. So I'm going to take an x out. You're dividing each one by x, so you're left with x minus 2 equals 0. Looking inside, notice x minus 2, I can't factor that. So I'm done factoring. Now I'm setting each factor equal to 0. So this is a factor here, and so is this one. So I need to have x equals 0 and x. It's not writing. X minus 2 equals 0. So x would be 2. So there's your two solutions. X equals 0 or positive 2. So you can plug those two in and it should be true. Alright, the last one. First step, set it equal to 0. Look at your x squared term before you start moving terms. My x squared term is positive, which means I want to keep it there. I don't want to make it negative. So that means I'm going to subtract 8x and subtract 24. So I get 0 equals, put it in standard form, so x squared term comes first, then your x term, and then your constant. And that's a minus 24. Okay, so first thing we look for is GCF. When we're factoring, notice they all have a 2 in common. So I'm going to take a 2 out. So you have x squared minus 4x minus 12. Looking inside, we need to check and see if we can factor that. So 3 terms, we want to do sum and product. So sum is negative 4, product would be negative 12, because that's a 1 in front of x squared. So that would be negative 6 and positive 2. X minus 6 and x plus 2. Now notice that's a 1 in front. We don't have to use the swing method because we get the same exact thing. Alright, so once we have factored, to solve the equation, you're setting each factor equal to 0. Okay, so notice this 2 here that we have in front, the GCF. If I set that equal to 0, that's not going to help me solve for x. So I don't need that whenever I'm solving. I need this part and this part. So x minus 6 equals 0. So your x would be 6. X plus 2 equals 0. So x would equal negative 2. So there's your two solutions. X equals 6 or negative 2. And you can plug those back in to your quadratic equation, and it should be true for both x values that you found. So that's solving a quadratic equation by factoring.